Thank you, Linda, and thank you, everybody. It's Tuesday morning, February 8th, and this morning the Senate Ag Committee is going to be talking with a host of people in regards to the Farm to School program. And we have a group of people with us. Betsy, were you going to lead off with this?
Yes, thank you, Senator Starr.
And good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having us all. My name is Betsy Rosenbluth. I'm the project director of Vermont Feed, which is a partnership of Shelburne Farms and NOFA Vermont. I also coordinate the Vermont Farm to School Network. So this year for Farm to School Awareness Day, we decided to showcase over 100 farms that are providing food to feed youth across the state through early childhood programs and school nutrition programs. So we want to highlight those farms that have been posting a sign. Hopefully you all have seen it. This farm feeds Vermont kids. That's been happening across the state. And we put together just a 2-minute video so that you can see your neighbors and the farmers across the state that are participating. So I think I have share screen here. There we go. And this will just be 2 minutes. Can you guys hear the sound? Great.
Not yet, but we can hear you well.
How about that? No. Okay.
No?
I think I have to do something more with sharing. 1 second. I'm going to try one more time. Make sure I get sound sharing. Huh.
You just don't want to share with us this morning.
All right, I think I got it.
Loud and clear. Very good.
All right. There we go. So the farmers couldn't be with us, but they were excited to be able to have us share their support and the number of farms who are participating. So really this morning, I just wanted to thank you, each of you, for helping to make this happen. So it's really been your support through the years that has helped Vermont nationally be such a leader in farm to school. And with the local purchasing incentive, the agencies of agriculture and the agencies of education are working together with us to bring farm to school, hopefully to every community, and we're on our way. So you're going to hear from the Agency of Agriculture today how we're seeing growing demand for the Farm to School and Early Childhood Grants Program. We've had a record number of applicants, and we submitted to you a handout that Linda posted that shows the grant funding over time. So the grant program began in 2007, that's 15 years ago, at $140,000. And with your help, we've expanded the program to support schools with universal meals. We've expanded to early childhood programs and providers. We've expanded our support of local purchasing, but the funding in the grants program really has not kept pace with the demand. In FY21, we were only able to grant about 24% of all the requested funds. So to meet the demand and to make sure that every school has the support to qualify for the local purchasing incentive, and to make sure we get universal meals with fresh local food, we really need to fully fund the grants program. And we need your support, this committee's support, with appropriations to do that. So just to remind you, we are asking this year for full funding of the Farm to School and Early Childhood Grants Program at $500,000. It is currently level funded in the governor's budget at $171,000. In addition, we're asking for your support of the governor's recommendation for $500,000 for the local purchasing incentive. So that's all I wanted to say today, but I'm available to help answer any lingering questions. And again, thank you for having all of us.
Yeah. So Betsy, did you say that what's in the governor's budget?
So for the Farm to School and Early Childhood Grants Program, $171,000. And for the local purchasing incentive, $500,000, which we think is pretty accurate. You'll hear from Connor how close we were this year to reaching exactly that amount.
So it's all we have to do is, we don't have to do much heavy lifting there, just keep it in there, right?
For local purchasing, keep that in there and support that, and then bump up the grants program.
Yeah, and what do you recommend that to be?
Fully funding at $500,000. So that would be another 300.
330, somewhere in that range. Yeah. Any questions from the committee? No? Well, Chris. Senator
Just a
Pearson.
quick question. Betsy, thank you. As you know, this is near and dear to my heart. And it's great to see it continuing to succeed. We always talk about this in terms of schools and in terms of kids and feeding kids, but it is also economic development. And we will do our part to nudge our colleagues down the hall in the virtual sense. But I wonder if you all have made this pitch to them. I mean, we're looking at tens of millions of dollars in economic development and business incentives and all of that. And what you're talking about here is foundational to stimulating rural businesses. And so I guess a question, but mostly an encouragement that you reach out to Senator Sorokin, get on his agenda and describe it to them in addition to the way you do to us as the impact it would have on our local rural business. Because it's just, it galls me to think of the tens of millions that we'll send there, and then we will fight for these relatively tiny appropriations, and we will, but just make that
Yeah.
comment.
Well, and Senator Sorokin has been a long time supporter. And I think it would be much easier to start there than even down, in approach, because he's constantly sending bills down with, a bunch of things in them and been well vetted and yeah, I think that would be good, and I think he'd be glad to have you in as well.
Thank you. We will follow up on that and look forward to speaking with them. So appreciate it.
And
I mean,
if he
the
does,
schools spend over $15 million every year purchasing food. So, it's a
15
real impact.
yeah, if he doesn't help you, we'll slide that picture over that hangs behind me and haul it through the wall at him. We have a direct line in there. Well, we'll move on. Who'd you like to, Connor, next? Or,
I think the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Abby and Trevor. are here.
Abby, yeah. We'll have Abby on then if she's with us. Good morning, Abby.
Good morning, Senator. Good morning, committee members. Abby Willard, Agency of Agriculture. We're fortunate this morning to have Trevor Lowell as the Farm to School program manager and leader to walk you through all the details about the program, as well as the recently released draft impact report. So if you're willing, I'd love to turn it right over to Trevor and have him talk about the work that he does.
Sure. Welcome, Trevor, and good morning.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning, Senators. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Farm to School program here. I believe Linda posted to the committee information page the draft impact report, so you should have access to that. I'm just going to provide kind of a summary of some of the things that the program has been up to and some of the adaptations that we've undertaken, partly in response to COVID, but just partly also in response to kind of continuous improvement of our program to meet the needs of schools and children and educators across the state. So the Farm to School grant program, as Betsy mentioned, started in 2007. I've been at the helm since July of 2019, just for some context. And 2021 was really a very challenging year for lots of people, educators and early educators especially. I think those two sectors were really hit in unique and devastating ways by the pandemic. So what we did with the program, we kind of looked at what we were offering, the types of support, both financial and technical assistance, and tried to really think critically about how we can improve that type of support to meet the needs that schools and students and children and early educators were facing due to the pandemic. The Farm to School grants program is really three different grants program. There's the Farm to School and Early Grants program, Farm to School and Early Childhood Grants program, which is the flagship funding opportunity. That's offered annually in the fall, and it's open to schools and early childhood educators. And that's really sort of a capacity building grant program. So grantees receive both a financial award of $10,000, or if they're applying as a larger consortium or a supervisory union, they receive $15,000. And then they also receive a free suite of technical assistance from Farm to School experts. So partners like Hunger Free Vermont, Vermont Feed, which is obviously Shelburne Farms, and NOFA, Vermont Community Garden Network, provide expert assistance and support to grantees based on what their needs are within their grant application and kind of the goals that they've laid out for what they want to accomplish. As you all know, Farm to School really addresses a number of different issues, everything from nutrition to ag literacy to community connections and development. And so that program is really meant to be very much grantee driven. And then we provide the support and the technical assistance to help the schools and early childhood educators achieve those goals. In 2021, we had 5 grantees. 3 of them were actually early education centers. 1 was a supervisory union and 1 was an elementary school. And those folks are well underway with their grant right now. It's certainly been challenged to kind of layer, a grant program on top of all the other demands that they have, but they're all working very creatively and very passionately on their projects with the technical assistance that we've provided for them. The 2 other grants were new in 2021, and those were partly in response to the pandemic. So we used to offer an infrastructure grant, which was based on a reimbursement model. Early childhood educators and schools could apply to receive, reimbursement funding for infrastructure like freezers or kitchen equipment or things that would facilitate, greater procurement of local food or their ability to do more nutrition education or activities like that. We decided to pivot that program and offer instead a CSA grant, which subsidizes a similar reimbursement model. It subsidizes the cost of CSA shares or farm shares for early childhood educators. We cover 80% of the cost, and then the applicant has to match 20%. We offered that kind of not knowing what the demand would be, feeling like there was a demand for more local food in the early childhood space. And we were really pleased to see that actually 46 programs from across the state applied, which far exceeded what we had budgeted. So we actually moved some money around in the program and were able to fund 30 of those applications. The overall impact of that was more than 1,000 children across the state benefited with more local food in their early childhood education centers and home care providers. And 23 farms received over $27,000 in revenue directly from that program. So we're going to continue to offer that. Application is actually open currently, and we're seeing high demand for that again this year. The 3rd grant is the Farm to School Vision Grant. The Vision Grant was partly in response to the acknowledgement that schools really didn't have a lot of bandwidth in 2021. And so we wanted to offer something to kind of the broader community. So we created the Farm to School Vision Grant and invited nonprofits to apply as well. Schools and early childhood centers were also eligible. The impetus and the kind of the driving force behind it was to try to find innovative ideas within the farm to school programming space. So there are lots of people across Vermont that are doing really incredible work under the umbrella of Farm to School. And we wanted to kind of find those projects and support them in a way that can be modeled, scaled, or replicated in other communities. So in 2021, we awarded South Hero Land Trust the first Farm to School Vision Grant for a project to integrate anti-racist education into their nature-based and farm to school programming with Folsom Community Educational Center. So they're underway with that grant right now, and a lot of what will come out of that are resources and curriculum that can be shared with other schools and other communities that was a similar project to really uplift the voices of BIPOC, Indigenous people of color across the state, and weave that into the farm to school programming. So we're really excited about the work that's happening there. I'll just mention a couple kind of supportive efforts as well. So we received, in partnership with Shelburne Farms, a grant from the Association for State Public Health Nutritionists to start the work to build a farm to early care coalition. So we've integrated that into the Farm to School network, and we're really focusing on early care providers as a really important segment to bring farm to school support to. Understanding that 0 to 5 is a critical point for children's development, and getting local nutritious food into these centers and home care providers, teaching healthy eating habits, exposing them to our agricultural community and those connections is really invaluable. So it's just a recognition that farm to school doesn't need to start at K-12, and we can really, get a huge head start if we start focusing our attention with early childhood educators. We've also provided support. We received a grant in 2020 from USDA to improve local tracking at schools across the state. So that has dovetailed really nicely with the local purchasing incentive We've been able to, with partners, develop multiple resources to make tracking easier and reduce the overall burden on schools to be able to track their local food and then report it. We're working with Agency of Education on that effort, as well as partners like NOFA, Farm to Institution New England, Northbound Ventures, and Shelburne Farms to take these resources, create them, and disseminate them out to the schools to really just make sure that the LPI program is as successful as it can be and that it's not a huge burden. I think there's also a really important equity piece here. Making tracking and reporting easier will allow more schools, regardless of their capacity, to participate in the LPI program. So we're excited to see where that goes as well. Both of those efforts are ongoing. Betsy mentioned the funding, so I just wanted to talk a little bit, kind of touch on that quickly. That's also in the impact report. We are level funded and have been for the last 2 years at 171,875. We've also been very fortunate to have the addition of a private philanthropist who's donated $20,000 over 5 years, $20,000 every 5 years for the past 5 years. So that 171 is actually 191. Unfortunately, this is the last year of that donation. So we're not sure kind of going forward if that will still be there for us. As far as how the program expenses break down, again, we provide financial assistance, but we also provide a lot of technical assistance. Sometimes that's partnerships and support from the organizations I mentioned earlier, like Hunger Free and Vermont Feed. But a lot of that is also coaches, which are really mentors for grantees. So these coaches stick with the grantees throughout their entire grant period, and they help them to just kind of navigate their goals and their plan and help them achieve what they want to achieve, connecting them with resources and just empowering them to accomplish what they set out to accomplish and making it a lot easier for them. We consistently hear every time we survey grantees that the coaches are a huge support for them and one of the best parts of that program. So that's we end up kind of breaking down on the funding about, probably 65, 70% in actual financial awards, and then the rest in technical assistance. And then just broad strokes, since this program started in 2007, we've awarded grants to over 211 schools and early childhood providers across the state. So those are all distinct entities. Some have received multiple grants to build on their work over the years, but when you tally that up, that's well over 50,000 students have benefited from this program since 2007. So I'm going to leave it there, but I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any clarification.
Yep. Well, thank you, Trevor. Questions from any committee members? I'm wondering, Trevor, we've been at this quite a little while now. Is our farm to school, or do you know if the food that we're feeding in our elementary schools and in our childcare outlets, is that pushing students at the high school level to request fresh grown, locally produced products at the high schools, or are the high schools participating as much as they should? I know it's a totally different eating situation in our high schools than in our elementary schools.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. What I can say is that, if you look at the kind of farm to school movement over the past 20 years, it really started in K-12. And, a few years, maybe 5 or 6 years after that, you really saw demand at the collegiate level really tick up among students who, went through the K-12 system, were exposed to local food, were exposed to farm to school, got to college and university and said, hey, why can't I eat local food in my college cafeteria or my university cafeteria? That's been well documented, that kind of transition from, putting the effort into K-12 and then seeing the return on investment at the college and university level. And this is
Yep.
one of the reasons we're really excited about pushing into ECEs. Not only does it expose the children, but early childhood providers are so integral to a kind of how a family navigates lots of different resources. They're often the kind of first point of contact for connecting families with resources. They do a lot in the food access and nutrition insecurity space. So to the extent that we can support ECEs with this, we feel like that will pay dividends, you know, as children and families grow and move into K-12 and then on to college as well. I think there's really strong evidence to suggest that, you know, building that continuum of support is really the best way to kind of build demand for local food, but also reach a lot of these nutrition and health goals and these community development goals as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great. And of course, the whole idea behind this is to grow a healthier society. And if you start with the children and work it up through, and pretty soon, real soon, they get to be adults and they continue to eat that way, they're certainly gonna be much healthier. So any other questions for Trevor from the committee? If not, thank you very much, Trevor, for all you do.
Of course, thank you.
Yeah, and Abby, did you have anything else that you wanted to add from Ag, or is?
I think
I
she
think,
hopped
had
off,
to-
actually.
yeah. So, and Betsy, is she still on? Who would you like to go next, Betsy?
Yep, we have Connor Floyd here with the Agency of Education.
Yeah,
Hi there, Connor Floyd, Grant Programs Manager with Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. Nice to meet you all. I'll try to run through this pretty quickly, just with an eye on the time. I want to apologize for not having a report in front of you. I'm going to throw kind of a lot of numbers your way, and the staff at the agency that are responsible for formatting those reports are also responsible for COVID communications. So they've just kind of been flat out for a while now. So we just closed the first round of the local foods incentive. And what we saw is that we had 23 of the 51 eligible supervisory unions apply for grant funding. All of the SUs that applied did receive grant funding. And as the grant program is structured, they applied for this baseline year grant, which had really 4 requirements. There was a local purchasing plan that they needed to develop. They needed to identify a food coordinator. They needed to identify which tracking method that they were going to use in subsequent year grants. And we provided 2 predetermined options for them, with the third option of going their own way. And all of the SUs chose either of the 2 predetermined options that we provided. And then lastly, all SFAs, regardless of whether or not they're applying, had to report their estimated local purchasing. And I think what's important here is 2 things. One, it's an estimate. We're not checking that at all. And it's also based on their own definition of local, which, could vary greatly across the state. So with those 23 SUs that applied, there was a total grant funding request of $489,838.20, which is 15 cents per lunch. So we were able to fund all of those grant applications fully. If every eligible SU had applied, the funding request would have been $907,833.75. So it's the amount of schools out there, the amount of lunches out there far exceeds the current funding, but it has shaken out to seem to kind of fit within what was allocated there. For that local foods estimate, the median response was 10% local purchasing. As I said, there's a lot of caveats there in terms of how sure people are of their responses. There's a just spectrum of what they classify as local and also how closely they're tracking that. But it does give kind of a rough idea of where the landscape may currently be in terms of local purchasing. Let's see here. I just want to check. Yeah, and so then really lastly, there's a few difficulties or kind of hurdles that we've identified that schools are encountering that we just wanted to make sure was on your radar. The first thing is that this is a pretty complex grant program, right? So to begin with, there's essentially two grants within this one grant program. There's this baseline year grant, which schools applied to this year. Next year, the schools that applied for a baseline year grant would then apply for a subsequent year grant in which they're actually tracking their local foods. We're going to need to audit that. And then there may also be schools that are just starting the process that are in that baseline year grant. So communication around that does just take a little bit more nuance. And then additionally, the local definition used, which is the Agency of Ag's Vermont local definition, is just proving to be, I think, a little more complicated and nuanced than some of the food service directors were expecting or used to. So combined with those two things, it is a fairly complex grant program. I think that leads into the second observation we've made, which is that there is a bit of an equity gap, or just in terms of what SUs are applying. And so we have seen wealthier districts applying for this grant opportunity, and there is a free and reduced rate of schools that applied was about 31%, and the free and reduced rate of schools that didn't apply was about 46%. So there is a gap there. I think this is also just compounded by grant fatigue that I believe Rosie has mentioned in previous testimony here. And then finally, based on conversations with the field and looking at that local foods estimate, we think that 15% may prove to be a high bar for some schools to enter into this program as a first step. And just with that, it's likely that not all of the SUs that applied for a baseline year grant this year are going to go on to receive a subsequent year grant. So there may be, a drop in some of the schools that are on this track. All of them may not proceed, if that makes sense. And I'll leave it there. I'm open to any questions that you may have.
Yeah, questions from committee members? The issue of equity, I'm wondering, I know it would probably mess everything up, but could you have two different price payment range arrangements where a school district with a lot of free and reduced meals would get a little higher premium payment than I mean, you guys that work with this, you folks every day, maybe do you have some suggestions on how to fix some of those 3 or 4 little issues?
I would hesitate to add more of those kind of little, details that would just add to the complexity of the grant. I think any simplicity that's able to kind of be added is really the best approach there.
And
so when thinking about adjustments to be made, I think that would really be just the more simple the approach can be with the program, the more accessible it will be to all SUs. And we'll have more data on this next year, right? Once schools have gone through a year of tracking foods, because that's really that's the big hurdle in terms of work and labor and hours spent in this grant to receive that award. It's figuring out what those local purchases are going to be and how it's going to work for their program, but then also tracking that.
well, of course, the last 2 years, it's been very difficult to even plan on how many students you're gonna have in class to feed.
Right. Yeah.
And I think if we ever get back to normal, we'd get it would stay hopefully pretty stable and steady, and same thing for the farmers. I mean, they don't know if they should put in 2 acres of a certain veggie or a half an acre, not knowing whether the schools are gonna buy the product. And we've had Rosie in a couple of different times we thought we were gonna have to get a little more money to pay the 15 cents, but then it with double checking, found that you folks had enough money with the 15 cents to cover the bill. It sounds like everybody's working pretty well together, and we got a few wrinkles to work out once we figure out how to flatten them out.
Yeah. And I would encourage, when thinking about how to make this a more accessible program, really trying to pull in as many perspectives or opinions from business managers, food service directors, right? They're the folks that are really doing the work and making this happen. So we kind of have that top line perspective. But when you really want to start thinking about the details of the nitty gritty, as much as you're able to, I'd recommend speaking with those folks as well.
No, thank you, Senator Pearson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Connor, I guess I'd echo a little bit the chair and asking for you to help us with suggestions. And Abby over at Agency of Ag has been on this for a long time, and typically, it's hard for the legislature to try and micromanage these programs. It more often works very much better if the folks administering them come to us with proposals. And I'm trying to think of the history, but I think actually it was not the committee that wanted this tiers in the first year. We sort of just wanted a straight up, you use 15%, we'll give you 15 cents. You use 20%, we'll give you 20 cents. But I'm concerned about your comment that you think 15 is a high threshold. In New York, we're getting testimony that they're easily exceeding 30%.
So,
and they've been at it only a year or two longer than us, but it's been very clear. Now you're seeing a movement, as I understand, over there, food directors pushing even further, wanting universal meals, something that this committee has been backing. And so I would just, I guess, say, please do help us improve the program. And to the extent you and the Agency of Ag can work on concrete solutions, I would guess you'd find a fairly receptive audience here.
I would say the big difference with the New York State program is that they include milk in those numbers, which we are excluding, which makes up, I'm not sure of the exact amount, but I've heard 15% as an estimate, which I think would speak a little bit to that discrepancy. And yes, I agree. I think the conversations have been more of with those schools that maybe haven't done any local purchasing, right? Or they think that they might do 1 or 2%. To those schools, I think 15% feels like a very big leap to be able to achieve, to start engaging with this program. That's really the one thing that we have identified thus far, is that 15% might be high, 10%, including a lower threshold to help schools kind of have an easier on-ramp onto the program. That's the one concrete thing that we've identified. We'll keep looking at other ways to make it a more accessible program, though.
And I would encourage you to work with the Agency of Ag. They're the folks that are defining what's local. I guess I hear sort of a theme of this. It doesn't sound like it's your program. You're sort of suggesting like it's our program. it should be your program. It should be the
Should be
state's.
all of our
It is the state's, it is in the state's interest in every sense to have this program be successful. Now, I'm don't hear me being critical. I know that you and Rosie just crank, and I've had a tiny glimpse at the volume of work and the absurdity of the federal regulation that you're trying to fit through and all of it. I get that. It is tough, but the truth is that it has been this committee that has driven this in the last several years. And I, for one, would welcome the ability to react to suggestions as you all are rolling this out to improve it and more of a feeling of a sort of working together, working with ag, working with ACCD. I mean, this is very straightforward economic development in addition to nutrition, in addition to, all of it. It's got a carbon impact if we're getting more food locally, on and on and on. There is really not, I just hope we can shift the approach so that it is more jointly owned by everybody. And I please, I'm not suggesting you have an easy job, not at all. I get it. It's tricky. And at the beginning, we have pushed this on you. And I just hope that before long, it'll shift in that sense of ownership.
Yeah, we'll keep, we're definitely owning this and trying to make it as easy as possible. That has been the, I'd say our primary objective with this from the start is how do we take that legislative language and make it as accessible of a program as possible for SUs to engage with. So we're excited to see that almost all of the grant funds were requested this year. We're hoping to see more engagement from some of those SUs that maybe waited. And yeah, we'll keep looking for ways to make it an easier program for schools to engage with.
Yeah, appreciate that. And Connor, do you know why milk is not included? I mean, I don't know why it wouldn't be, because we supply milk to all of southern New England, so it's pretty apt to be locally produced milk. Is there a reason for that?
I was not on the team when the bill language was being written. I believe Betsy or Helen there was a reason, and they may have a better recollection of exactly why. I just wouldn't want to give a half correct answer to that.
Yeah, well, we'll check that out with them. Thanks a lot, Connor, for your showing up this morning and being with us and your work that you're doing. But certainly we all have to work together to make this go and to make it better and stronger. And so thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Helen, do you know why we don't include milk?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that briefly, Senator. Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting us in. And for the record, my name is Helen Rortvedt. I'm the Farm to School Program Director at NOFA, Vermont, which is part of the Vermont Feed Partnership with Shelburne Farms. Pardon me. And regarding your question about milk, this has been a topic of much discussion over the years, but the short version is essentially that this program was designed to incentivize additional local purchasing, and schools already are required to purchase milk for every meal that they serve. And their fluid milk purchases tend to already equate to between 12 and 15% of their food budget already. So if we were to include milk in this program, we wouldn't be incentivizing them to purchase additional products above and beyond what they're already required to purchase. So that's the short version of the story. If we had a couple more hours together, we could get into more of the details. But and I just wanted to, if I may, I just wanted to highlight a couple more points. And I want to thank the Agency of Education and Connor in particular for working really hard to stand up this program very, very quickly on a very short timeline. and in the midst of a very difficult school year. So, you know, in order to really evaluate the impact of this program, I think we're just going to need to settle in and have a little bit more time under our belts. We were really thrilled to see that almost half of the school food authorities in the state this year already applied for their pilot year, which is really exciting and a real demonstration of their commitment as well. But also recognize that there is a lot on everyone's plate this year, and school nutrition staff and business managers in particular are really, really juggling a lot this year. And we had the privilege of reaching out to all 51 SFAs during the period where the grant was open this fall. And we had some great conversations with folks who were really weighing their options and thinking strategically about how to use this program. And there's a number of SFAs that are planning to wait and apply for their pilot year next year because they're hoping they'll have more capacity. And there's sort of this funny timeline that you know, when schools are applying for their pilot year grant, it is also the same school year that they need to be tracking their local purchasing so that they'll be eligible for the subsequent year. So it's just a little quirk of the timing, which I think will work itself out over time. But schools are looking at that, they're thinking strategically, and they're saying, you know what, we'll have a better chance of documenting and getting to 15% if we start at the beginning of next school year. So there's a number of schools that I think we can anticipate applying next year and then being able to continue and be eligible moving forward. So, but yeah, I would agree with Connor around a couple of the challenges. This is, you know, we're building the plane and flying it too. So we're learning a lot this year, but I'm confident that we'll be able to work out some of the ripples and some of the stumbling blocks. But overall, we're just really thrilled by that initial response. So.
Yep. Questions from committee members? Yeah, we could use some good organic milk in our hot lunch programs.
Oh boy, I would be happy to come back and speak with you all more about that.
Get away from that watered down 1% stuff.
Yeah, and that's actually something that NOFA is thinking about and looking at, especially as we consider our responses to the loss of the Horizon Organic contracts in our region, really trying to think about how institutions can serve as a support. So obviously I don't want to get ahead of myself by any means, but someday you might see me back here trying to figure out how we could get better quality local milk into our schools and what kinds of incentives or supports schools may need in order to be able to do that.
Well, I think you'd have a very interested audience if you come up with some little plan that we could start off with.
Excellent. Well, stay tuned.
Other questions from committee members? No? If not, thanks a lot, Helen, for being with us this morning. And if the others are on, thank you. And we'll certainly be thinking about your testimony this morning and the extra funds that you need for next year. So
yeah, thank you so much, Senators. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So committee, we have a group in to chat with us in regards to 188 that we really need to work on to get going on that and get it out of the room. So we'll get started right away on S188. And I think we have Michael with us this morning and Steve Collier and
Michael will be here in just a minute.
Yeah. We're supposedly trying to work on what can be considered, I believe, a farm, and we're trying to have it so that small growers, especially the outdoor growers, but I don't see why it wouldn't be inside growers as well, but the small tier one be considered agriculture. So we could, there's Michael. Morning, Michael. So we have Michael and Steve with us, Steve Collier from the Agency of Ag. And we had one question, I guess, or well, probably a lot more than one, but we had one in regards to using the word farming for our tier one small producers of cannabis. And I think we would, I don't know if you guys had a chance to chat at all since we last dealt with this issue. Michael, I guess we would have you on first if you did have an opportunity to catch up with Steve and have a visit about the ins and outs of calling that agriculture or farming. So go ahead.
Yeah, yes, sure. This is Mike O'Grady with the Office of Legislative Counsel. Last week when the question arose about the characterization of small cultivators as farming, you had questions about what that would mean, what the legal consequences might be for farmers and any other potential legal difficulties. You asked me to confer with Steve and with the board. Last night, Steve, Bryn, and I met for about a half an hour to talk about the issues and the concerns. And I don't know if you want me to speak to what the agency's concerns were or not, or if you want Steve to do that.
It doesn't, I guess you could fill us in and then Steve will comment on your take of it for us.
The agency through Steve raised some concerns about the agency regulating small cultivators as farming. As I discussed with you last week, one of the provisions that is concerning to the agency is the provision in federal financing law and federal financing contracts that requires a drug-free working place and compliance with the drug-free working place law. And I believe the agency has concerns about what that would mean for their continued eligibility for certain federal funds and how they would enforce certain requirements and provisions under federal loans and assistance that they administer for the agency. In that discussion with Steve and Bryn, there was the proposal that, well, first there was the discussion about what cultivators or the board is looking for in their desire to characterize small cultivators as farming. And they don't necessarily want the full suite of all the benefits that farming receives. They don't necessarily want to be free of electrical contracting laws or be allowed to drive their ATV on the side of the road or not have motor vehicle plates or etc. So we talked about what the board is really looking for, and what they're looking for is that a small cultivator be treated in the same way that farming is for the purposes of Act 250, for the purposes of municipal zoning for eligibility for enrollment and use value and eligibility for the sales use tax exemptions for agricultural inputs and agricultural equipment. And then Steve and Bryn both discussed whether or not it would make more sense to have small cultivators regulated by the board, Cannabis Control Board, but a provision that designates them as receiving that Act 250 municipal zoning, use value eligibility, and sales tax eligibility provisions. And then the Agency of Ag would be separate. They wouldn't have to deal with the drug-free workplace law in their administration of any cannabis regulation, because they wouldn't be doing cannabis regulation. Then the small cultivators would achieve what they were looking for in effectively maintaining their farming status, because I assume you still want them to be farming prior to, that's an assumption on my part. And still be able to enroll and use value.
Yeah.
They would be subject to the RAPs and the other water quality and environmental requirements. So that's probably the biggest regulatory benefit that the small cultivator would not receive that farming does receive. But that was the discussion. So I did not draft any language. That's a big shift from what's in S-188. And so I just wanted to bring this proposal, this conversation to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Michael. I don't know if the committee, any questions from committee members before we switch over to Steve? Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't mean to jump into in before Steve if he wants to comment on what Michael just said, but I'm still wondering what level of engagement does the Cannabis Control Board have with the federal government? Aren't we just shifting the I'm not sure what the right word is, but the interaction between the Agency of Agriculture and the federal government? Aren't we just shifting that over to the Cannabis Control Board? And I'm not sure that we're gaining anything.
No, I don't think that you are. The Cannabis Control Board is almost wholly a state-based organization, state-based authorized organization.
Okay.
They, to my knowledge, don't interface much, if at all, with the feds, and definitely not in the way that the Agency of Agriculture does in receiving, not only administering assistance for farmers, but the Agency of Agriculture receives assistance, financial assistance on its own from the USDA, and is subject to requirements, conditions under that assistance as well. So I think it's a significantly different kind of regulatory atmosphere, regulatory environment.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think the board, if the cannabis board, hell, they'd be all locked up if they worked through the feds, as it wouldn't be allowed, and they'd be doing something illegal just by congregating, maybe. And even the folks like at the conservation districts, I mean, they interact with government programs and government money all the time. So, I don't think we could allow them to even control it. But anyway, Steve, let's hear your take on it.
Well, good morning and thank you, Steve Collier, for the record, for General Counsel of the Agency of Agriculture. So Mike did a nice job summarizing it. We really appreciate you having us in to discuss this issue. It's something that's been on my mind for a long time and troubles me pretty significantly. And it's all related, obviously, to the disconnect between federal and state law and marijuana's status as a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law. So we have pretty serious concerns both about the impact to farmers who choose to grow marijuana and also to the agency if we were asked to regulate it. That said, I do think there's a clear pathway forward that can essentially achieve whatever it is that the legislature wants to achieve without involving our agency. But just quickly to sort of outline some of the things that we're worried about, we're assuming the worst won't come to pass and that people will not be prosecuted and their assets won't be forfeited. But nevertheless, there are a series of collateral consequences. Some probably the most important for farmers is federal money. So any farm that was also growing marijuana would not be eligible for USDA aid, would not be eligible for NRCS grants. I don't even think NRCS employees would be able to go on the farm. I'm not certain of that. I have seen a document from California that suggested that that was the case. And also, I don't think farmers would be eligible for federal crop insurance. And especially in the era of the pandemic, where we've been relying so heavily on federal money for CRF funds and ARPA funds, farms who are growing marijuana certainly would not be eligible for any of that federal aid. There's also a serious issue with banking, as everyone knows. But if farms are also growing marijuana, most banks and financiers won't work with them because of the prohibition against money laundering. So that's an issue. Also, in terms of federal taxes, farmers who are growing marijuana have to pay federal taxes on their income, but cannot deduct any of the expenses related to the marijuana grow. So there's just a series of considerations that farmers are going to have to make when they evaluate how to do this, if they choose to do it. But then the other overlay that concerns us as the government agency more is that if we are regulating cannabis, our agency receives a lot of federal money. And in receipt of that federal money, we are required, as Mike referenced, to have a drug-free workplace. So we cannot have our employees working where there are drugs, certainly not possessing them, touching them, regulating them. So if we were involved in regulating cannabis, we would potentially have our federal grant money suspended or terminated, or we could be debarred for up to 5 years from receiving that federal money. And there may be a way to work around that with certain employees and who's doing exactly what, but there's so much federal money in the agency and our job duties overlap so much. I think that would be incredibly hard to do in a way that's effective and efficient. So, and also the agency provides either matching grants to a lot of federal money, especially for water quality, or we sometimes provide federal money itself. We can't do that to any farmer who's growing marijuana. So our involvement with marijuana growing is very concerning from the potential risk to our federal assets. We also cooperate a lot with the federal government, especially in water quality projects, and we have to communicate with the federal government. And if our employees are involved in regulating marijuana, I'm very concerned about not being able to have open communications with the federal government, because arguably we should be taking the Fifth Amendment whenever we're talking to the federal government about activities that we're taking that are involved with cannabis. So I just think it puts us in a really untenable position to be involved in receiving federal money and in regulating cannabis. And I guess the overlay itself, we just believe calls for a complete separation. So if you're going to, because of the way that the federal government regulates cannabis, we think the safest path forward for how the state regulates cannabis is to completely separate state and federal money and to completely separate those regulators who are regulating the cannabis industry. So our hope is that the Cannabis Control Board, and we think it supports this as well, exclusively regulates cannabis. And we actually think it makes sense for them to regulate hemp as well, which would be a consolidation of the cannabis, and so much of the equipment that's used for processing the flower, making the products, growing the fields will be the same. And since the 2018 federal rule on hemp is much more stringent, it's our sense that most people who are growing hemp now may want to grow cannabis, and that they may be producing both CBD and marijuana. And so it just is probably cleaner to have all of that fall under the Cannabis Control Board, with the exception that anybody who wanted to grow hemp that's federally recognized as hemp and can be sold through interstate commerce could still register with the USDA, which runs the exact same program that we run as of this year. So we don't want to foreclose anyone from growing hemp that doesn't want it to be marijuana, but we believe that consolidating those resources under the Cannabis Control Board makes sense. I think the board believes that as well. And also we have a couple of positions at the agency that could go to the Cannabis Control Board to help with, to help them be able to do the regulations themselves. So we think that's the cleanest mechanism to do this, is to have the Cannabis Control Board be the exclusive regulator. There are some areas where we would still have to be involved, and most particularly for the inputs with pesticides, because we're the only agency that can regulate pesticides. But we think there's a way to do that so that we are regulating that input without being involved in the actual on the site pesticide application. But we just have to be careful about some of those carve outs. And we also we're happy to give guidance to the Cannabis Control Board. As an example, if the legislature chooses to apply the RAPs to cannabis, the ones that apply, and have the Cannabis Control Board actually regulate the growers through the RAPs, we'd be happy to give guidance to the Cannabis Control Board about how we do that, how we think they should do it, but without the on the boots involvement of actually being amongst the cannabis itself. So that's our feeling on the issue. We really do appreciate the input. We also think, as Mike alluded to, and this is a policy choice, and the administration hasn't developed a position yet, but we do believe that it's possible to give marijuana growers all of the same benefits that you want to give them that farmers currently enjoy. So as Mike suggested, it would be possible to have cannabis overseen exclusively by the board, but also give people who grow cannabis the Act 250 exemption, the sales tax exemption, the municipal zoning exemption, and or the current use exemption. So we think to the extent that you want to extend those benefits, we think it can be done without calling it farming, making it subject to our regulation, and therefore potentially putting our federal dollars and our federal loans at play. And this is a little bit outside the legislation arena, but from my perspective, and I think I certainly can't give advice on this point, but I think farms should be doing the same thing. If farms are going to grow cannabis, in my view, it's very important that they think about separating all of those activities from their existing farms. They ought to seriously be thinking about separately incorporating, ensuring that their farms, that their other farming aspects are not in any way touching cannabis, because they will lose access to federal money. They will lose access to federal technical support. And so to the extent possible, if they're going to go this route, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to have separate businesses that are doing separate things, and to not in any way merge growing marijuana with the other parts of their business, because it just exposes them to even greater risk, I think.
Yeah, Chris?
Thanks, Steve. It's helpful to try to work our way through this morass. Didn't we give the Agency of Ag regulatory oversight of the medical program? I remember it was at public safety for a while, but I'm a little hazy on where it resides now.
So Senator Pearson, that was before my time, but I don't think we had it. I think the only thing we've had that I'm aware of is some sort of vague oversight over testing. And our lab is not engaged in marijuana testing, but we have been tasked with developing a program and we've only applied it to hemp to date, but I do remember that it was moved, and this was not when I was working with the agency, but I remember hearing that it was moved from DPS, I think because they had some of the same concerns about federal funds, although that's a bit speculative on my part, but I don't remember where it landed. Mike might know.
I think it's honestly, I don't know where it is. I have to.
Okay,
I have to
I'll
check
try
with
to find
Michelle.
out. I guess my memory is mistaken.
I know
So,
since I've been here, Senator Pearson, we haven't been working with medical marijuana, and that's a little over 2 years now.
Senator Colmore?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Steve, what would change for a strictly hemp farmer if it moved over to the Cannabis Control Board? In other words, would there be any difference in terms of what that person enjoyed as exemptions or regulation or anything, or is it pretty much just the same landscape, but it just moves over to a different regulatory body?
So that's a great question, Senator. And I think it just depends on how the transition is made. So right now, growing hemp is farming, and we are completely comfortable with that designation as long as it's federally compliant hemp. So, but however, if hemp was going to be more, if the definition of hemp was more permissive than federal law under the Cannabis Control Board, then I think all of the same issues about marijuana arise, because if it's not hemp under federal law, then it is marijuana. So I think if it were going to move and allow it to be more permissive, then my recommendation would be the same thing, that it not be considered farming, that it be considered growing cannabis, and that whatever exemptions you wanted to apply to it would exist. However, I also believe it makes sense to leave a carve out for those hemp growers who are complying with federal law to still be farming, because that it is farming and it's totally acceptable. And anybody who wants to grow hemp for CBD or anything else that complies with the Delta 9 threshold, there's no reason that they still have access to all federal programs or most all federal programs. And so my suggestion would be leave a carve out for those who want to comply with federal law, but then allow others who want to be growing cannabis that doesn't comply with federal law to be monitored by the board. Things like Delta 8 come to mind, which is some states allow it. We do not under the hemp rule, but we only allow it because we didn't think that hemp is supposed to include psychoactive substances, but obviously cannabis does. So there isn't any reason not to allow Delta 8 if it's monitored appropriately, which is a task that the board could choose to take. It's not something that our agency can do. We can't regulate. We don't have any ability or expertise to regulate psychoactive substances that are not permitted under federal law. So I don't know if I answered your question very well.
No, you did. The next obvious question, and perhaps you or Michael can't answer it. We need to get Bryn in, because you both seem to suggest that the CCB undertake this. Are they in favor of it? Are they equipped to do it? Will it mean additional appropriation for them? There are kinds of those questions. And maybe, as I said, you can't answer. So.
Well, I certainly can't answer all of that, Senator, but when Mike and I spoke to Bryn last night, we did ask her if she was in favor of the CCB, the Cannabis Control Board, regulating hemp and cannabis and regulating it exclusively, and she seemed to be in favor of that. I think she is concerned about having enough support to do the work. And I do believe that part of her willingness to take on hemp is gaining those resources, which, given that hemp is the same plant as marijuana, it does make some logical sense to partner those resources in terms of evaluating how to grow and process those plants. And then what the products that come out of that vary depending on how you treat the plant, but it is the same plant. So from an efficiency perspective, it does perhaps make more sense to have the board exclusively regulating that. But I do know that there's a request, and I don't know where it is, to increase their staffing. and that, that's a separate issue, but obviously she needs the support to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's,
Could I?
Yeah. Go
The-
ahead, Michael.
The CCB already has jurisdiction right now over the small cultivators, so they've already contemplated being the ones to regulate them because that's what the law has said. What you're contemplating in S-188 is to change that. So they already have that authority and hopefully capacity. With regard to hemp, I think I'm not saying anything about the policy decision. I think you need to think about the mechanics of when it would transfer, if it were to transfer, because by the time this law is enacted and signed by the governor, you're probably already past a registration requirement or cultivation requirement for hemp. So I think you need to think about the mechanics of that. And maybe that's a good thing, because then maybe that then gives the CCB a year to develop what it needs to develop in terms of a request for appropriations and staffing.
Yeah, and as far as their employment, I think the supplemental bill that we just passed in the Senate, they have eight employees in there. They've had a few, and then the House gave them 3 more, and then we added a bunch in. So they have 8 of their 11 on the way in this supplemental bill. And then in 23, we're supposed to add the other 3 members, which wouldn't be needed. We didn't think they would be needed until late in 23 anyways, because they're just going to start, if they do start, it'll start growing this spring. So, but anyways, other committee members have questions? So Michael.
I'm sorry. I wanted to see if anyone else had a question. I do have a couple more, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, well, go ahead, because it's all I wanted to know is from Michael is could he redraft the thing if we so decide and turn it around so the CCB would have control over this with the carve-outs that we've been talking about. But we can get to that after, because your question may be in the same line.
A couple questions. If we shift the hemp program at a certain time, there's a lot of fees that go with that. I remember because I reported that. Are you saying that all of those would track as well?
Yes, I don't think there's any language yet for this that I'm aware of, but yeah, I think that the fees would have to track, the 2 employees would have to track. That's
Okay.
what we've discussed informally. Yeah.
And then the other question is, most people with a level head about these issues believe that the feds, it's a question of when they're going to deschedule this, because it's so preposterous to treat it the way we treat heroin and other pretty significant substances. So at that point, assuming we reach that point and this conversation would have an entirely different tone, would you foresee a reversal here? I mean, we deal with this in this committee all the time of which state agency is showing up depending on what it is we're talking about. And I think that is sort of frustrating for Vermonters to have to understand effectively which uniform might show up as the regulator that day, and then it can lead to some duplicative feelings of, dare I say, harassment, and so it's in our interest, at least where I'm coming from, to be as streamlined as possible. So if the federal shift happens, could you imagine sort of a more direct partnership between the board and the agency in terms of this regulation, or should we just sort of take it one step at a time, or what's your thinking along those lines?
So Senator, I haven't had direct conversations with other folks at the agency about this, but our whole concern is the federal overlay. So if this was just another crop, it would be another crop, but instead it's a crime to grow or possess under federal law. So we haven't gotten past that point, but I certainly wish that the federal government would decide what it's going to do, because it creates a morass, for an untenable morass. I mean, we're in a federal system where the federal government reigns supreme on these issues, and we have this disconnect. It's just bad government, and it really frustrates me as a lawyer whose job it is to make sure that we're following the laws, to have it impossible to do so. And so, it's kind of akin to perhaps immigration, how we just never get a solution. But yes, I think that if it was legal, I don't think these conversations would be anything close to what they are right now.
Yeah, thank you. So, Michael, maybe we could have a trigger that said something like, in the event the feds make this change, the board, shall work with the agency to let the legislature know of proposed updates, or something that imagines the future, whether it's a year from now or 5 years from now. We are going to want to be able to respond, and I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
Anthony?
I should know this answer, but who's the control board is beholden to who? I mean, it's an independent board, but where does the buck stop with the Cannabis Control Board? Like, if it's not going to be the ag department coming in and having sort of like conflicts with the control board, who would it be?
They aren't under public safety at all, or do you
Or
know,
administration?
Michael?
No, they're a quasi-independent board,
Oh,
kind of like the PUC.
and what
But
about
they-
DHCB and all them?
But here the governor does appoint. He did appoint Pepper and the other two, correct?
Yes.
With Senate confirmation.
Yep.
So
we had a nominating process like the Green
Right.
Care Board, and
So it's effectively an administrative agency then.
Yeah.
And
So-
would we have to, just to finish, would we have to, if we're not going to define the small cultivators as farming, we have to define them as something. We define them as small cultivators of cannabis, I presume. We don't have to come up with a definition, do we? Is that something we'd have to grapple with?
There's already a definition.
Okay.
And how much work would it be to redraft the bill so that, and have these carve-outs put in there? Mike?
It's not going to be hard. You actually already have some carve outs for them in the cannabis law. So I just would need to work. It's section 2 of S188. I'd have to rework section 2 of S188, 7 BSA 869, and then get rid of section 3. Probably do it as a strike all, because you'd also, if you wanted that trigger language that Senator Pearson was referring to, I can build that in. So it's not going to be that hard.
Yeah. Well, committee, what's your pleasure? Would we want Michael to get that drafted up for us and see, tomorrow we have this back on the schedule in the morning sometime. I think it's later in the morning. But it would be good, I would think, to have it drafted up so that we aren't gonna cause more trouble than good. And so if there's no objection, we'll move forward with that idea. And then tomorrow we'll go back through it and see if we've got all the pieces in the right places. And Steve, you're welcome to come back tomorrow if you have time. I think we've got 188 on. At 9:45. So if you can come back tomorrow, Steve, you're more than welcome. And Graham, and you're still on, and Jeffrey, and I think we're gonna have to invite you guys back tomorrow because it's almost noon and we've got another meeting at 12:15. So we're running out of gas this morning, and it isn't because we did something wrong. It was because we had to do our house floor stuff, and that took longer than was anticipated. So if you two can come back tomorrow, we'd appreciate it, and we'll work you in. So anything else from committee members?
All set?
All set?
Yep.
Well, thank you, Michael and Steve, for all your
Thank you.
work over the weekend, and